My name is Ed Stumpf. I'm an investment director at African Infrastructure Investment Managers, or AIM. AIM is a private equity fund manager which specializes in infrastructure, and it has a portfolio of around $2.1 billion spread across 17 different countries on the continent. In that capacity and in the context of the conference today, I'm also a representative on the board of a company called African Ports and Corridors Holdings, which is an investment vehicle established by AIM to pursue ports and logistics projects across the continent of Africa. So I think in the port sector, the one thing that's very interesting to look at is the regional variation in the penetration of PPPs. West African region has been very successful in PPPs. There's a very large number of PPPs, and there's a very well-established model for PPPs in West Africa through the landlord-port model. East and Southern Africa have a much more mixed record. In South Africa, as most people will know, there's a high prevalence of state-owned entity involvement in the port sector, and that's acted as a disincentive to PPPs until there's some clarity around how the model works. And in the East African region, there's a mixture of models at play within particular ports. Some berths have been concessioned through PPP processes. Other berths are still operated by the port authorities, but there's no simple landlord-port model in operation. I think there is a trend towards landlord-port models, but that's not yet been fulfilled in many markets. So I think in the transport sector, the question around how much integration there is on different supply chains is quite key to ensuring that logistics costs and costs of end products are kept at their minimum for customers. The port, by nature of its geographic positioning, is typically a part of the supply chain where barriers to entry are very high. Because whether or not it's a concession, usually there's a specific gateway area where it's very hard for competitors to establish a presence. And so I think it's important that the port owner and operator doesn't also own the supply chain that's further downstream and closer to the consumer, because that confers upon them a monopolistic advantage in providing customers to end users. At AIM, we believe strongly in the merits of common user ports. So you secure the port under a long-term arrangement, you provide a common user facility where all cargo owners can bring their products through, and you allow for competition at the downstream end of the value chain to flourish. And that's the best way to get the costs down and to get the right scale efficiencies that you need at the port side. So I think one of the key things to look at in Africa is to look at transport on a corridor basis. Often the competition that matters is not competition between players on an individual corridor or between public and private sectors. It's between the different logistics corridors. So to give an example, copper belt cargo, which is typically copper from the mining regions in Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, will travel through one of multiple different corridors, sometimes to Durban, where the majority of it goes, which is the north-south corridor, and sometimes to Dar es Salaam, which is the Tazara corridor. Tazara corridor is significantly shorter, and so logic would dictate that over time most of the cargo should travel through the Tazara corridor. But the reality is that the opposite happens, and there's many reasons for that. But I think one of the key points is that in looking at the sector, one really has to look at the efficiency of a corridor on an end-to-end basis, not just at the port or at the port's efficiency. So at AIM and at APCH, we focus very much on integrated logistics. We don't necessarily own everything of that supply chain, but we focus very much on trying to deliver an efficient solution, and specifically a solution that is focused on rail, because we think that Africa really does need to deliver cargo by rail over long distances. The key point about that is really to focus on backhaul volumes on key rail lines. So making sure that cargo is not just going one way, but going on the other way as well, to try to create some kinds of efficiency on these corridors. So one of the kind of challenges we see in the port sector is that there's often a focus on very large landmark projects in key markets. And we think that needs to be complemented by much smaller projects The key risk that developers or owners of ports run is often ramp-up risk, particularly if they're greenfield ports, which means it's very hard to predict the speed at which cargo will start to come through that particular terminal. And one of the easiest ways to mitigate that is to build a terminal that's quite small and scale it as the market demand develops. The challenge, of course, with that is that often those projects are less exciting to the financial markets, they're less exciting to the host governments. And we think that as a financial investor, we're uniquely positioned to build those projects together over time and actually deliver scale over a period as opposed to one-off at the start of a large project. I think this conference is very much at the heart and soul of what AIM does and what APCH does. We invest in infrastructure, and the vast majority of the infrastructure investment opportunity is PPP in its nature. So I found this conference an excellent opportunity to engage with fellow stakeholders on both sides, be it private sector or be it public concession granting authorities. And it's amazing how much overlap there are of common projects that we're either working on as we speak or have recently worked on. So it's been an excellent way to meet and engage with key stakeholders in our industry.